mostly so that we could stay public and be connecting with community while we're all quarantining ourselves. So, my name is Kira. I'm a member of the Kingston Tenants Union. This is Fox.
Hello.
He is also a member of the Kingston Tenants Union. He's one of the founding members. And today we have a guest joining us, Michaelangelo. Thanks so much for being on with us.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. So the Kingston Tenants Union is a group of tenants here in Kingston. We're organizing in our city and also in Ulster County. We are tenant-founded, tenant-led, tenant-run. We don't have any outside funders. We're basically working to collectively learn about what our rights are and fight so that tenants have safe and accessible housing. Anything to add to that, Fox?
As usual, Kira, you summed it up beautifully. KTU is a working class solidarity group fighting for the rights of tenants. We're not an agency or top-down organization. We're totally horizontal, and we will never be funded by Peter Buffett or anyone else.
Important to note. Cool. Michaelangelo, could you tell us a little bit about the work you're doing and the groups you're organizing with?
Absolutely. So my name is Michaelangelo Pomerico. I'm a member of the Mid-Hudson Valley Democratic Socialists of America. I'm on the steering committee there, and I'm also the interim chair of the Ecosocialist Working Group. So ecosocialism, one of the things that we hear a lot about in the discourse generally in this country is, thinking about terms like green capitalism, right? And what market solutions can deliver within that system. So ways that we can decarbonize while still turning a profit. And what ecosocialism is really about is it's about providing an alternative to both capitalism and green capitalism and creating a faster roadmap for how we can decarbonize the national economy while also creating a just transition for working class people and making sure that when we come out the other side, it's working class Americans that own that system and have control over that system, not corporations. So, COVID-19 has exposed how incapable these systems that exist right now are in responding to a crisis like this. We're seeing in real time how the greed of the fossil fuel industry is failing to meet people's needs right now, especially in regards to immediate relief for utility payments, especially at a time when the fossil fuel companies are making record profits. There's no reason that they, in addition to the richest of New Yorkers, especially given that we have so much money in this state, shouldn't be able to shoulder the burden of cost and ensure that all renters have access, and homeowners for that matter as well, have access to gas and electric, payments facilitated by those individuals and those companies during the duration of this crisis, without fear of going into debt, experiencing shutoffs when the moratorium is lifted. There's a moratorium right now on shutoffs of utilities, but it's only lasting as long as the moratorium is active. And as soon as the governor decides that that moratorium is over, anybody who's then unable to pay is going to owe a lot of debt. And that same goes for rent. I know you guys have members who are already participating in the statewide rent strike. There's a lot of overlap here in terms of, the issues and kind of the consequence of all these compounding crises. So the alternative to the system we have now is publicly owned utilities. And Mid-Hudson Valley DSA has been really fortunate to be working with Public Power Coalition, which is a statewide coalition made up of a ton of amazing organizations, a lot of DSA chapters across the state, groups like Metro Justice, Pulp, and it's really a spinoff of the Energy Democracy Alliance, which is another organization that we've been really lucky to work with a little bit. And that's an organization that's been doing a lot of really good work on facilitating conversations with NYSERDA and working on a suite of legislation to push for expanding the New York Power Authority, which is a state authority that produces 25% of New York's energy, mostly to state property, federal buildings. Niagara Falls is an example of one of NYPA's generation sites. And so we were looking to, expand their powers, give them the ability to pursue generation projects, as well as create a document, a piece of legislation that would allow municipalities and territories across the state to municipalize utilities, to basically take control and make them publicly owned. So when COVID hit, the coalition kind of made a decision that there was an immediate need that needed to be met. We saw what was happening in the conversation nationally around rent, and we felt that something similar had to be done in regards to the utility companies. So today on this call, we're passing some information to all of your viewers. The coalition's been working on an amazing utility strike toolkit that teaches and tells people, like, what the coalition is fighting for, right, which is an immediate cancellation of all debt accrued during this period. We're also fighting for a moratorium on utility payments during this period. So we don't expect anybody should have to pay their utility bills during this period. There are far more important things that individuals need to be focusing on, like their families and their loved ones. And even if you're small business owner, there's a lot of accrued costs during this period of keeping your business afloat. You shouldn't have to worry about paying the bills. So the Utility Strike Toolkit is a really amazing document. It was put together by the coalition. It contains everything any individual would possibly need to organize a utility strike in their area. It also includes information on how organizations like the Kingston Tenants Union or like Mid-Hudson Valley DSA can participate as an organization in the utility strike. There's information there for individuals. If people want to pledge as an individual to participate, that's there as well. And there's also something called the story bank. And this is maybe the most important thing that any individual can do to participate, in addition to signing the pledge and to say, I'm a striker. We're asking that if people have been personally impacted by COVID in terms of being able to pay their utility bills or being able to pay rent, that we really would love for you to share your story with us so that we can get that out to people and make sure that people understand that this is real. People have been impacted dramatically by this, and that there's a real need that needs to be addressed here.
Wow, thank you so much. Yeah, I'm really excited to have you here and sharing that with us. Obviously, you're explaining, the parallel between folks struggling to pay their rent and folks struggling to pay their utilities. And as you said, also, COVID-19 has really been highlighting how fucked up the systems are that demand that we're paying these things. So I'm really excited to kind of dig into that. I feel like you just said a lot, and I'd like to maybe take it apart a little bit.
Absolutely.
Maybe let's start with, so you mentioned the toolkit, the utility, what is it called? The Utility Strike Toolkit?
Yep.
And I have that up on the screen for the viewers. Yep.
Awesome. Thank you, Fox. So let's see, maybe we could start with a basic, for folks who don't know, what a utility strike is. Could you go over that for us?
Yeah, absolutely. So the purpose of a utility strike during this period is for those who can't pay. It's an opportunity to make your voice heard and to basically build in the same capacity that you're striking maybe for rent right now, or that those strikes are happening nationwide, statewide. The idea here is that collectively we have more power if we're in it together, right? So for those who can't pay, we're asking that they pledge to be a part of this, because that allows us to kind of get a sense of how many people are unable to pay their utility bills right now. But then there are also those of us who maybe can pay, but feel that this issue is important enough that we want to participate in solidarity, right? And that's where this pledge comes in for those who can. We're still asking that if you're passionate about this and you feel like it's an important issue, just like rent, that you pledge to also strike with people who can't pay. So really, the utility strike is about trying to build collective power and bargaining power with the state and with the utility companies to both demand immediate relief from the state legislature and the governor, but then also long-term, this kind of allows us to build consensus and power around the public power legislation and around a pathway to have publicly owned utilities long-term. Because that's something I, as a member of DSA, really believe in deeply, that the utility company should be more or less kind of nationalized on a state level, and that we as the people should own and be responsible for those utilities.
Oh yeah, totally. We've been, the last few weeks, or months now, we've done a few of these. The last few months we've been talking about rent striking during COVID and how there's so many folks who aren't paying their rent out of necessity, right? But that when we start talking to our neighbors and are withholding our rent collectively, you have so much more power and so much more security doing that as a group. Hell yes. So I love hearing you talk about that with utilities. I'm curious. So when a tenant withholds their rent, they're talking with their neighbors who share a landlord, and they're collectively putting up a fight and like building power against this one landlord who's shared. So with folks who are withholding utility payments, who are we making a demand against specifically? And like, does that question make sense?
Absolutely. So you're right. Like in the case of rent, there's usually one person that you owe rent to, right? It's very simple, the relationship between the renter and the landlord. In the case of utility
The sound cut out a little bit. I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me now?
Ooh. Fox, can you hear?
Yeah, I can hear. There's a little bit of an echo. Sometimes if the volume's too loud.
Okay.
It came back. I'm sorry about that.
No problem. So yeah, so like the relationship between the renter and the landlord is pretty simple, right? You owe your rent to one person, or maybe it's a building owner co-op kind of thing, but usually like it's between you and your landlord. And in the case of the utilities, it's much more ambiguous, right? There's lots of different utility companies that exist in New York State. We have Central Hudson here, but this fight is also kind of brought into the fold National Grid, Con Edison, right? So it's a very different fight. And the collective power that we need on this front is much more of a coalition and much more statewide, because we don't really have any one individual in our municipality to kind of pivot our anger and collective power towards. So the target here in the short term is the state legislature and the governor, because they have the most power in the immediate future to cancel existing debt, but also put a moratorium on utility payments during this period. In the same way that kind of collectively the statewide rent strike has been arguing for those same things in regards to rent on a state level, that's really the only mechanism that we can kind of fight for, because the reality of the situation is that utilities are kind of a state thing, right? It doesn't come down to any one municipality. Even Central Hudson as an individual utility, theoretically, right, we could organize every Central Hudson utility ratepayer against Central Hudson, but it's not really going to be able to address the issue of like utility costs and the bills that are piling up statewide. The geography is it's very difficult. It's very complicated with the PSC, the Public Service Commission, really having broad oversight over the utilities in general. So that's kind of, if that helps to answer some of those power dynamics. And real quick, if you're interested, there's also been a lot of like questions that come to us around like legality of a utility strike, because I know that's definitely something that comes up in regards to rent. And like right now, based on the research that we've done with the Public Utility Law Project, various legal services outlets across the state, that we've basically come to the conclusion that it is legal. There's no federal law prohibiting withholding utility payments. And utility companies cannot single out customers or bring civil or criminal charges against anyone for withholding payment. But they can disconnect your services without a trial after a certain length of time if you're not paying. However, because there's a moratorium on shutoffs right now, no one will be impacted by that statute. So the people who are at the most risk right now are people who have existing debt, right? There's concerns about if this can impact your credit. It can't. Utilities companies do not report you for non-payment unless you close your account, or unless they close your account by shutting off your power. So again, this is kind of like that trade-off, right? That as long as we have a moratorium, people are protected. It's when that moratorium is potentially lifted that things get difficult. And that's really the same with rent too, right? We're facing a huge debt crisis with rent, and we're facing a very similar crisis in regards to the utilities.
So is the utility moratorium, is that wrapped up with the rent moratorium? Does it follow the same timeline? Or?
I think it's a similar timeline, but I believe it's a separate order. But I'm not super sure on that. But I'm sure it's separate.
The rent moratorium, the eviction moratorium ends on June
18th or something, right? Or
why am
June
I
8th?
blanking? I keep wanting to say 20th, but I know it's August 20th because there's like two of them. There's the first one, which totally covers everyone, no questions asked, and then there's the August extension, but there's some wiggle room in there that people can sort of get around that. Landlords can get around that, but Kara, why am I blanking? When is the June? It's June 5th.
I thought it was June 20th, and then
June
I read
20th.
today that it was June 15th.
15th, okay.
That courts were reopening on June 15th. That being said, we think they'll be really backed up and like overflowed. So probably folks won't be having their court cases like go through the system until later. And then that the August extension covers less people, protects less people. So I feel like we're kind of gearing up for the June date. But what I read in the utility strike toolkit was that the utility that the date for
it was set. I found it. It was set to expire June 20th. So June 20th, and then goes to August 20th.
Okay, yeah, that sounds right.
Sorry.
So what I was, no, it's okay. Reading about the utility payments is that it'll last the duration of COVID. Is that correct? So there's not really an end date for it.
So this kind of brings up some of the gray area. We found out yesterday that the Assembly was debating a piece of legislation that, to the best of my knowledge, would create a long-term deferred payment agreement process for people who have outstanding debts with the utility companies, and would basically, I believe, put protections in there so that shutoffs would not occur until people have the, I guess basically this legislation, as I understood it on the call, would give people as much time as needed to pay back what they owe. Obviously, that's not what we really want, right? We want a blanket cancellation, but this is still good news. And it's also potentially really good news for a utility strike, because it alleviates some of the concerns around what happens if the moratorium is lifted and all these strikers owe this debt. Are they then in potential risk of having their utility shut off? If people who owe debt previously, they're in an even more difficult position, because when that moratorium is lifted, they have no buffer period, right? Like they could have their utility shut off immediately. So that piece of legislation, I wish I could give you more information on it, but it's literally was like the last 24 hours and we're still kind of digesting and figuring out how to respond. But that potentially is good news for ratepayers in New York State.
So when you say utilities, I feel like water is usually a municipal utility, so that's not really, and that's the one that they can't really shut off, especially in summer.
Actually, that's not entirely true. So we had the coalition's been in talks with Housing Justice for All, and as part of that, I believe it was the Public Utility Law Project. I could be mistaken on that, but I know we had conversations with people who specialized in water. And the moratorium that's in place right now it only affects privately owned water companies. And the majority of residents in New York State get their water from public water sources. So the shutoff moratorium for water is not even really being enforced, as far as I understand, really intensely right now. And it doesn't cover all New Yorkers broadly, not even the broad majority of New Yorkers. So
they can shut off your water for non-payment right now?
I don't want to comment too much on that. It's a little bit out of my wheelhouse, but I know that when I was shocked when I learned at how little protections were in place for most New Yorkers in regards to water shutoffs. And it was scary. I remember learning about it and I was stunned. Yeah.
The main one that you must be dealing with then is electricity, right?
Gas and electric. Yep.
Yeah.
That's primarily what around. Yep.
And gas isn't a huge deal right now because it's summer, but electric. Mm-hmm. I remember reading a story a year ago where a woman's electric got shut off, and she had medical devices that were attached to her electricity, and she died because her electricity was shut off. I think it was for non-payment, but they screwed it up somehow and just lost her payment or something. Even if she didn't pay, she doesn't deserve to die for non-payment. So I think that people think of utilities and they're they're nice, but we don't need them. But we actually do. We rely on them quite a bit, and there's a lot of people who utilities are a life and death situation. We're not sitting here on naked and afraid or survivor. Like, we're modern human beings that like need utilities. So
Yeah, I mean, utilities are a lot of things, right? It's your air conditioning. We're coming into what's probably going to be a record-setting summer in terms of temperatures, and we're dealing with a crisis which is going to keep a lot of people home and out of spaces that they could normally retreat to for access to air conditioning. So, just things that we maybe take for granted, right? Like your AC, become impacted when you potentially can't pay your bills. So yeah.
Absolutely. Even cooking, like medical devices, like you're saying, especially while we're in a health crisis. There's a lot there. Damn. I have a question for you, Michelangelo. In my building, I'm a tenant, but my utilities are included in my rent. How can a tenant in my situation participate in a utility strike, or if not, how could they support the utility strike?
So, that's a really good question. I don't necessarily have an answer for you. I would say that you can still sign the pledge, because I believe that the pledge is not necessarily that you're a striker, but that you are supporting the utility strike, and help to get other people to sign the pledge and help other people join the strike, right? Help collect those stories for the story bank. Like, there's a lot of outreach that has to be done to educate people on what role the utilities play in their everyday life and how a utility strike will empower a lot of people, a lot of renters across the state, to have more collective power over the utility companies and over the state government for a large matter.
Hell yeah. I like that answer.
yeah,
Yeah,
this
the relationship
toolkit.
against the landlord and the renter, especially in regards to utility payments, is complicated. In like, if your rent is not itemized so that your utility is a separate cost and it goes, it's all part of your rent in general. I don't know. Maybe it involves lobbying other tenants against the landlord to have the landlord participate in the utility strike, right? It's complicated.
Yeah, this toolkit that Michelangelo sent over is really nicely produced and has some great information. There's a page that even has like phone scripts, email scripts, flyers. So it's just like with tenants' rights. Even if you're in a position where you're not in immediate danger, using that, informing solidarity and like just helping the greater cause and doing what you can is super helpful. So this is a great resource here.
I like that. I like the idea of like pressuring a landlord to become part of the utility strike.
Yeah.
We've been talking a lot with like during the pandemic, folks who are rent striking, that an option to include in your demands to your landlord is that the landlord support lobbying or like demanding that the state waive mortgage and rent payments. And I think that's important. And I like that as an option for folks who want to support the utility strike to also make that demand of their landlords, whether or not the landlord is directly paying the utility bill. Hell yeah. Let's see. I know you touched on like publicly owned power when we first started talking. Could you tell us a little bit more about like, I don't know, I guess what that would look like, or like, why is that the goal? Tell us more.
Yeah, absolutely. So, like, I think as renters and just as New Yorkers in general, right, there's a long history, even just in our area of Central Hudson, consistently raising rates. I believe they still raise rates every 2 to 3 years. And I think it's a pretty steep rate increase when they do raise it. So the idea behind publicly owned utilities is that collectively, if we municipalize the utilities and it becomes a shared economic resource, that we can then no longer run it as a for-profit industry. So that is, good for the sense that we can adjust rates and we don't have to be as concerned about rates going up for the sake of profit. But then it's also really relevant from the environmental standpoint of accelerating what's happening on a state level in regards to the environmental crisis. So, right now there's this thing in New York State called the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which basically outlines as a document of guidance, like what the state needs to do to reach carbon neutral by 2030. And, like in Orange County, and I believe in Ulster and Dutchess as well to a certain extent, we're fighting Dam Scammer, which is a proposed frack gas power plant that the local areas are trying to build, right? And one of the things that we're being really frustrated with is that all of the science around frack gas basically puts new frack gas infrastructure in direct competition with what the CLCPA set out to declare as a document of guidance. And New York State has this elusive reputation as being a really progressive state, but the reality of this situation is that we're not that progressive. And if we're going to if the state is going to put work into trying to progress these needs regarding the climate crisis and release documents that outline what their strategy is, they should stick to that, right? And we should be working on only building renewable infrastructure. So there are two bills that we were pushing. One would require by mandate all state and municipally owned properties to transition to 100% renewable energy by 2025. And the other bill would expand the New York Power Authority to be able to pursue generation projects and also purchase and acquire existing renewable infrastructure. So an example there is let's say there's an offshore wind farm that the state wants to build. This would allow the New York Power Authority, which is a state agency, state authority, to basically pursue that energy project over a energy service company. And that bill also bans ESCOs, energy service companies. So, your Dan scammers, et cetera, they basically become non-existent, and it creates a path for the state to pursue more renewable energy projects without the profit incentives of the collective bargaining power of all these fossil fuel industries kind of weighing down on what the state decides to do. So that was kind of the angle of that aspect. And then the public power aspect comes from the third bill, which I can really only represent in the state that it's in now, which is what exists in the Assembly as a document and in the state Senate as a document. But it's also the one that we're consistently, prior to COVID, having the most conversation about, because it being statewide, and as I'm sure you guys know, the politics between upstate and downstate are very complex. We wanted it to be as inclusive a document as possible to make sure that everyone felt like they had a fair seat at the table. So the document right now basically would create a downstate power authority that would encompass Central Hudson, Con Edison, and National Grid's territory as it pertains to New York City. And it would divide all of that service area up into various territories, and each territory would be governed by a democratically elected board of trustees. And that board of trustees would have oversight over that territory and would basically, through a eminent domain proceeding, acquire the stock value for that service area and convert it to being a publicly owned utility. So that bill, again, because it was primarily focused, I believe they wrote it up after last summer's blackouts in New York City. There was a real need to kind of address the harm that Con Edison was doing by prioritizing wealthier customers. And that's why it's really tailored towards downstate. We're very lucky in that Central Hudson is included in that piece of legislation. So we're kind of still fighting for that bill because it really does, it involves us. It directly impacts our service area. But we're working on other ways to make that legislation more democratic and more representative of the broader state, making sure that all of the various municipalities across New York State have fair say in how that document is shaped so that the bill reflects what every New Yorker needs during that, in the future, which is publicly owned utilities in a process of getting that across the entire state.
Yeah.
So much of that is over my head, what you just said, but I love publicly owned, municipal utilities. I think the more municipal stuff we have, the better off we are. And admittedly, I'm not super well researched on that topic, but anecdotally, I mean, the stuff that's handled by the city at a municipal level, the water, it's way cheaper. I don't even worry about it. It's but then things Central Hudson or the freaking oil bill. I have an oil tank that I got to fill up. It's $500 to fill up the tank. It's unbelievable. And I don't know. There's also all this conversation around nuclear power, and I know a lot of people on the left really like nuclear power. Something that I don't know like anything about, and it kind of scares the shit out of me because of like stuff like Chernobyl and Fukushima and stuff like. But everyone seems to like love nuclear power. They say it's clean burning and whatnot. But I was pulling up Dan Scammer because I've never heard of them. But apparently they're replacing the Indian Point power plant or something like that. They're the new. Are they the new called nuclear power?
Oh, is that Dan Scammer's going to be replacing Indian Point? I think they're replacing it with frat gas, right? That's the
Oh, okay.
Maybe I'm not as familiar. That's more like Lower Hudson is Indian Point. Lower Hudson DSA has been doing a lot of work down there with Indian Point, as far as I know. I could definitely provide comment on nuclear if you feel like it's relevant to the conversation.
It doesn't have much to do with renting, but I'm curious. Yeah, no. We should probably pull it back to the task at hand, which is, I mean, I think it's great. I think municipal stuff will work out really well for people who are renting, and I think this is cool that like this offers people another way where, you know, we talk about forming tenant associations and striking against your landlord all the time, and that can seem very like confrontational and scary to people. So this is kind of a nice way to dip your toe into something where it's like it's this big giant, you know, company. You're not like going face to face with any of these bad guys. You know, you don't have to worry about confrontations, and everyone's kind of in this together. So
and a lot of this is targeting the state government, right? We're fighting Cuomo, we're fighting the state legislature, and in a lot of cases, you know, these are people that are pretty accessible. You know, like my state senator, James Skoufis, was at a local picket in Newburgh supporting the Teamsters, and we had a chance to talk to him about the New York Health Act. Cool. You know, so it's like your state senators, you can call their office. They're pretty easy to get a hold of. You know, they have their staff is kind of there to help direct your questions and concerns to that representative.
Yeah.
So these people that we can call, we can try to get meetings with, right?
Yeah.
And that's really where like we're kind of putting the focus. And I will say, like, kind of bringing it back to rent and for renters, you know, this public power project is really all about reducing costs for renters in New York, right? And for homeowners in New York. So when we talk about like reducing and lowering rates or making rates more consistent, a lot of that can come about through this project, because when you look at the cost analysis for renewable infrastructure when compared to fossil fuel infrastructure, like one of the problems right now is that when people talk about solar, it's usually rooftop solar, but that's like the most expensive form of solar power that you can pursue, period. Like when you start getting to utility and community scale solar, where it's something that goes up on a municipal scale, it's much cheaper and much more efficient in terms of producing energy. So, you know, when we talk about New York State's commitment to green energy, it's really happened in a green capitalism format where it's all about the consumer and not really about more like public planning and, you know, like planning for a municipality in terms of how we can get an entire county onto, you know, onto a renewable green grid, right? So a lot of that talk about reducing rates and making utilities more affordable comes back to, well, why are they so expensive right now, right? There's like a lot of costs attributed to fossil fuel infrastructure. It's not that cheap. Frack gas is not that cheap to build. You have to bring it in, right? You have to frack it. Oil isn't cheap to produce. I mean, it's dead cheap right now, but it's not a cheap resource. It has a huge environmental costs, and it isn't cheap. So we can easily reduce rates by pursuing a renewable infrastructure across New York State and really committing to developing a green grid. I believe firmly in that. I know the coalition, that's why we're doing this work, right? It's because we believe that the end goal and the end result for ratepayers is going to be a better system coming out of there, where they have more control over their options and over what they can purchase.
Wow. I feel like that was the first thing that came up for me when Alex was like, hey, my friend Michaelangelo is down to talk about a utility strike. Is like collectively owning our resources and lowering costs and making these necessities more accessible for everybody, especially the folks who are most vulnerable to losing them, like tenants, like communities of color, like low-income communities. Yeah, I feel like there's just such a strong correlation between the two struggles. They're so connected. I'm looking at my questions here that I wrote down for you, but I feel like I've gone through all of them.
I mean, I would love to add one thing because you brought up like frontline communities, communities of color, right, that are often underrepresented. In the city of Newburgh, they've been struggling with access to clean water for a long time now because of cross-contamination with Stewart Air Force Base. And adjacent to that now, they're looking to build Dan Scammer in right along the waterfront. And when we talk about the pollution that frac gas infrastructure can produce, or any fossil fuel infrastructure can produce, that's a community that's already been struggling with environmental pollution for a really long time and is now being exposed as a frontline community, in a community, majority color, that's now in a really difficult position with Dan Scammer, where they're facing even worse pollution in a community that's already been struggling. And it's just insane.
Yeah, I mean, that's like the pattern we're seeing over and over, right? Especially this week while we're all like grieving and collectively organizing against like police brutality and things like this. Like, folks who are just most vulnerable in this country are low-income folks of color, queer, trans, LGBTQ plus folks.
Absolutely.
And I feel like, Newburgh is such a clear example of that from like an environmental perspective. Do you know of groups in Newburgh who are organizing? Are folks there involved in the Mid-Hudson DSA? What are ways that folks who are able can support them?
Yeah, so the one that comes to mind off the top of my head is the Newburgh Clean Water Project. They've been fighting for clean water in the city of Newburgh for a really long time. On the ground, we've been working with Community Voices Heard, not as much recently because of COVID has changed how operations have been kind of going in general, but their Hudson Valley office is down in the city of Newburgh, and we had been working with them pretty closely to fight for rent control in New York State. So good cause eviction was one of the things that we had been fighting for, and tenants' rights in general in Newburgh, which is much needed. And I know I'm very excited to work with Alex and Fox about bringing their knowledge and experience with the Kingston Tenants Union back to Mid-Hudson Valley DSA, and kind of trying to branch out into the city of Newburgh with some of that energy and intellect. Absolutely.
Hell yeah. Yeah, I feel like we're a small group here in Kingston, but I know that we're also surrounded. And I mean, we work with folks like in Ulster County in general. I think Newburgh's part of Orange County.
Yes.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, anything that we can do in order to like support their struggles as tenants, as people struggling for like environmental safety, clean water, anything like that,
Yeah, Newburgh's definitely going through the same kind of stuff as us with gentrification and all the city folks are like, ooh, this, look at this place with all these, low prices and fixing up places. Yeah.
Yeah, Newburgh needs some collective power, big time. Gentrification is happening down there, and it's a community that is in need of some empowerment for sure. And tenants' rights, one of the things that we were looking into and kind of tying all the energy stuff back into what it is to be a renter in New York, like, things like land trusts and ways of building, community power outside of even just a tenants organization, of really kind of building up from the ground, community ownership over property. That's definitely like some of the conversations that we've been having in Mid-Hudson Valley DSA about, thinking about ways that we can really empower that community to take control of the city and really like own it.
Yeah, I wonder, like, I'd love to you just give us a few names and I'll look them up just to like be able to listen to the folks who are there and like what they're already doing, and then be able to support them in any way they ask, and help, I don't know, raise their voices in any way that we can.
I actually feel really guilty. I'm not like super connected with a lot of like on the ground community groups. Probably should be. I know that within the chapter, Peter Frace, who's on the steering committee, lives in the Heights down in the city of Newburgh and has been really actively involved in the community down there with community gardening, things like that. And again, like fighting for all the same things that we've discussed in regards to utilities and housing. But honestly, like if people want to get involved down in the city of Newburgh, like get in touch with Mid-Hudson Valley DSA as a start and like, help build it with us. It's still early on. Like we're still a young chapter and we're still kind of getting off the ground and kind of solidifying relationships with local organizations. Again, Newburgh Clean Water Project comes to mind, is a great organization down there. CVH, Community Voices Heard, is another that's been doing good work in the Hudson Valley. But it's really like one of those things where we're still kind of on the ground floor and there's a lot of work to be done. And this is not just for Newburgh, right? This is for like all of our municipalities across, across our area in the Hudson Valley here. So like join groups like DSA, right? Like work on building tenants organizations. Like this is all like, we need to build collective power, right? So any organization that you can join where you're doing that is like a good way of starting to have these conversations to start building these networks.
Yeah, DSA is pretty great. I was one of the founding members. We founded, when was that? Last year or the year before? 2018? 2019? The years, they just fly by.
2019.
But it's nice because it's like you have these three cities. So we have Kingston, Newburgh, and then Poughkeepsie, which makes up the Mid-Hudson Valley DSA. So we're kind of spread apart, but we cover like a nice geographic area, and that's like the main city in each county. And then north of us there's like Albany, and south of us there's the Lower Hudson, and but it's a nice like main hub, and we've got a lot of new members, more and more all the time. And there's a lot of different like steering or groups. Is that the right way to say it? Steering committees. Or working groups. That's the right word.
Yeah.
So there's like a housing working group, and then there's Michelangelo's on the what do you call this group? The
Ecosocialist working group.
Ecosocialist. Yep. So it's nice that people can kind of pick their area where they want to focus their energy, and then we can come together as like these different cities where we don't have a whole lot of density, so it can be harder, but like pooling together a little bit of resources kind of helps that way. So if anybody's watching right now, joining the Mid-Hudson DSA is great. Just all you have to do is join the main DSA, and then they kind of funnel you into your region. And you don't have, if you can't afford to, they can like make exceptions and whatnot, but it really is very cheap to be a dues paying member to DSA, and it's worth it. They also do a lot of electoral work, so it's like any kind of wherever you find your little niche that you want to start to collectivize. But what's nice is that we're all sort of operating under the same kind of ideology, so that can be a really nice way to get things going in an area where it feels like go ahead.
It's also a really exciting time to join DSA in general. I know Mid-Hudson Valley DSA is experiencing a real period of growth right now with Bernie Sanders ending his campaign. We have a lot of people that were organizing with Bernie joining our chapter, and just incredibly motivated individuals who are doing a lot of amazing work. If you join DSA, our chapter gets a percentage of the dues that you pay to national. So you're supporting our work by joining. Even if you don't want to participate, you're still contributing to the overall work and to the effort. And we have an amazing team with our culture and onboarding working group right now, who's doing a great job fielding new members and bringing people into the fold. We're really trying to step it up with member outreach and bolster relationships with new members as they come into the chapter. So I really urge people, join DSA. It's been life-changing for me. I felt like I've gotten a lot of power in life joining this organization. It's opened a lot of doors and a lot of really amazing relationships with great people, both locally and across the state of New York. So there's a ton of work that we're doing, whether it's environmental work with this stuff here that we're discussing today, utility strike and public power. If it's New York Health Act, right, providing a single payer state option and Medicare for all. There's a ton of fights that we're involved in right now, and like I said, electoral work. So people should think about joining. It's a really good organization, and there's a lot of really good work happening right now.
Well, yeah, I feel I've been having a lot of conversations with friends this week. I mean, all the time, but especially this week. Folks, I don't know, I guess reaching out, kind of being like, how can I get more involved? Like, where can I plug in? And my answer almost always is like, I see the struggle for housing, the struggle for healthcare, and like the struggle for environmental justice as kind of the three like struggles at the forefront of our time, our generation
Hell
right
yeah.
now, in terms of like how like economics, like race, class, and all of these different systems of oppression are affecting communities that are more vulnerable or the most vulnerable. And I feel like the DSA, and this was true when I was living in LA too, like the DSA has these working groups and these campaigns going on and are really like figuring out how to plug into each, all coming at it like with the same values and the same principles. Um, and when I was part of the LA Tenants Union, we worked a lot with a LA chapter of the DSA, and I'm excited that that's the case here in Kingston as well. That like the Kingston Tenants Union is able to link up with the DSA in this way and fight all these systems of oppression together and really try to come together as community, to build our collective power against those systems.
Yeah.
So
I think you touched on so many nice things, both of you, about like it's healthcare and it's housing and it's the environment, and there's all these little issues, and they all stem from this system that is messed up called capitalism, and like that's the main unifying thing for all these things, and those systems are held up by things like racial injustice and all injustice for all oppressed minorities. That's sort of like the mechanism of maintaining capitalism, so that people can maintain power and profit over the people. And then we don't have things like housing and healthcare and all the things that we should have in a regular society that we should have access to. But it's like that root issue is like, well, capitalism is wrong. It's fucked up and it's not working. And that's like the nice thing is that like DSA is like, we're socialists. Like we're not hiding the fact that we are anti-capitalist. And there's so many groups that will address like they'll get in these tiny little buckets and say, well, racism is the main issue, or housing is the main issue, or this is the main, and it's like all those things are connected. There's no such thing as like these siloed issues that are like separate from each other. It's all connected. And then if we can fight the root of the issue, and we're all unified in this fight against the main thing, it helps so much. And then we can literally do more as a giant group, because we're we might all go off and like work on our individual issues, but then when it all said and done, we're all saying, okay, but we're all here for the same underlying issue, which is to end capitalism.
Yeah, man. Solidarity is one hell of a drug.
Yeah. Yeah. Totally.
Maybe that is a good note to end on. And I don't want to cut anyone else off.
No, it is hot as hell in here. I can't wait to turn the AC back on.
I hear you.
You guys so much for having me. It was a pleasure. Hopefully we'll be able to do this again in the future.
Yeah. Thanks for coming on, Michaelangelo.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much for coming on and sharing with us. We're gonna link, or maybe we have already. Thank you, Fox.
Somebody will do it.
The explanation of the bills and the legislation, and also how you, our viewers, can link up and sign the petition either with an organization or as an individual to support the utility strike. Awesome. Thanks again, Michaelangelo. Thank you, Fox. Thank you, Alex, for everything behind the scenes.
Thanks, y'all.
Have a great week.
Take care. Stay safe and stay healthy, everybody.
Thanks, you too.
Bye.
Bye.